cathedral of air. The first alien sentence I ever understood did not arrive as a sound. It arrived as a shift in the air so slight that the instruments caught it before the people did. And by the time half my team began reporting pennies, rain, jasmine, hot plastic, pears, lightning, and childhood in no two matching combinations, the machine under the Atacama had already decided that we were worth speaking to. In June of 2036, I was 38 years old, Chilean, chronically underrested, and, through a combination of bad luck and an unromantic decompression accident over Nevada 8 years earlier, so smell-impaired that I had built a career on the archaeology of things that kept still. Stone suited me, bone suited me. Ceramics, stratified waste middens, collapsed walls, seals, inscriptions, the patient lies of corrosion, those were honest. You could brush them clean, scan them, date them, argue about them for 10 years, and they would never change shape because you had entered the room. Air was different. Air forgot itself while you were measuring it. Until the summer, we found a civilization that had made atmosphere into architecture. The anomaly lay under a dry basin east of Yungay, in a patch of desert so old and waterless that microbial ecologists used it to rehearse for Mars. A lithium survey drone had found the void first. It wasn't looking for history, it was looking for ore. Its muon map showed a cavity 91 meters long with straight internal planes and a surface scattering signature that should not have existed in geology older than breakfast. By the time the mining company realized they had found something they definitely did not want to drill through on live stream, the ministry had stepped in, then the International Deep Time Survey, then 3 universities, then 2 private aerospace sponsors, then security. By the time I arrived, the desert had a perimeter fence, a landing pad, 6 habitat cylinders, a solar field, and enough non-disclosure agreements to choke a condor. We spent 9 days sinking a sterile shaft through halite, compacted silt, and a glassy welded tuff that made my teeth ache every time the cutters hit it. The layers above the cavity were undisturbed. That fact kept me awake at night. If the upper strata had been broken and patched, I could have told myself it was a modern installation, a military bunker, a billionaire's eccentricity. But the sediment package was clean. Cosmogenic exposure dating on the deeper glass gave us a last disturbance age of roughly 74,000 years, with an uncertainty band I did not trust because the numbers were absurd. When people say absurd in archaeology, they mean one of 2 things. Either the date is wrong, or history is about to become much less convenient. On the morning we breached the roof, I was standing on the lower platform in a chilled suit under 6 banks of white work lights, watching the cutter worry a neat circle through stone the color of old blood. The air in the shaft tasted, according to Jin, of dust and copper and exhausted batteries. According to my wrist chemband, it contained oxygen at 20.7%, negligible volatiles, and 1 overworked atmospheric chemist's sweat. "Pressure differential," Noor said in my ear. I looked at the thin strip of smart film over the breach. It had bowed inward, not outward. "There's atmosphere in there," I said. No one answered for half a second. Then Commander Warren, up on the upper rig, said, "SEAL protocol. Nobody improvises. Nobody becomes famous." The final plug came free with less drama than I had wanted and more than I had expected. It dropped into darkness below, hit something that rang like struck porcelain, and the shaft microphones picked up a long, delicate exhalation. Not wind, not exactly, more like a room learning that it had been opened. The smart film trembled and then clouded with condensate from inside. My helmet HUD painted the pressure climb in blue, slightly above ambient, nitrogen-rich, oxygen lower than ours, argon, carbon dioxide, traces of methane, sulfur species, ketones, terpenes, aldehydes in a concentration profile that made my band flash yellow, then orange, then produce a modest corporate chime that meant, in essence, what in God's name is this? Jin made a noise that from anyone else I might have mistaken for fear. What? Oh, he said very softly. Oh, that is not contamination. He was breathing too fast. His biometric thread pulsed red in my display. What do you smell? It was habit. I asked everyone that question because I no longer trusted my own nose. After Nevada, I had regained enough olfaction to know when coffee was near and when a lab was on fire, but the world of nuance had collapsed for me. Everything rich came flattened, everything layered became blunt. Perfume was one note, forest was one note. Rain on pavement and oranges and a person you loved, one note each, isolated and unreachable. Jin swallowed. Rain, no, not rain. The idea of rain if rain were made of metal filings and green fruit. That's not a smell, Warren said. It is if you're having a stroke, Noor muttered. Tomas, our materials tech, said, My grandmother's sewing box. Burnt sugar, Kellen from security said immediately. Static, Noor said at the same time. I stared up at the scrolling chemical profile on my wrist. 312 volatile compounds above threshold, including at least 40 I did not recognize, and 8 with chiral purities so extreme they might as well have come from a laboratory run by angels. Nobody smelled the same thing. That was my first clue, though I did not know it then. We sent a crawler in before any human descended. The camera feed came up in my visor, a chamber the size of a church nave, all soft curves and pale surfaces under the crawler's cold light. The floor was a matte black material that reflected almost nothing. The walls were ridged with sweeping vertical flutes, like someone had frozen airflow into stone. No furniture, no screens. No visible doors beyond the one we had opened above, no obvious machinery in the human sense. What it had instead were columns. They rose in pairs along the chamber like trunks of giant white reeds, each one ribbed and perforated with thousands of tiny pores. Between them hung membranes as thin as onion skin, folded and pleated, tremoring almost imperceptibly in the chamber's internal circulation. At the far end stood a fan of branching structures that looked absurdly like a grove of antlers grown from ceramic roots. I remember saying, "It's beautiful," into a channel meant for work, and nobody making fun of me. Archaeology begins with description because meaning is always a temptation and usually a trap. So I described. The chamber interior was fabricated, not carved. Surface topography indicated additive layering on the micron scale. The white columns were a ceramic composite shot through with something carbonaceous. The membranes appeared proteinaceous but mineral stabilized. There were no straight corners. Even the ceiling was a shallow vault textured with nested spirals and branching ridges. The whole room looked less built than cultivated. And everywhere, invisible but measurable, the strange compounds were pulsing out into the air in repeated bursts. Environmental control system, Warren said. Preservation matrix, Noor suggested. Art installation by a psychopath with access to time travel, Tomas offered. Jin had stopped talking. His entire attention was on the gas stream data pouring through the crawler's sampler. I should have understood then that he had already gone somewhere ahead of the rest of us. Instead, I did what archaeologists do when confronted with the impossible. I made a grid, assigned labels, logged context, and climbed down into the oldest room on Earth that no human being had ever seen. The smell, everyone else's smell, hit harder on the chamber floor. I could detect only a faint medicinal coolness and something remotely floral, but the reaction in the team was immediate. Noor froze halfway down the ladder, eyes unfocused. Tomas began laughing and then apologized without explaining why. Kellen's head snapped around as if someone had called his name. "Helmet stay on," Warren said sharply. "No direct exposure. Sample through ports only." The chamber was warmer than the shaft by 4 degrees. The air moved in slow, intricate streams against my suit, almost affectionate. That sensation bothered me more than the artifacts. Rooms do not usually feel curious. Up close, the columns were stranger still. Each pore along their surfaces was ringed by a fine fringe of dark filaments that lifted and settled with shifts in airflow. Sensor arrays, I thought. Filters. Cilia. I said none of that aloud because I could hear excitement straining my voice, and I preferred skepticism in the field. The walls held patterns, but not writing as we know it. The ridges branched and rejoined like river deltas or bronchial trees, only with a precision too great for ornament. Jin swept one with a laser scanner, and the resulting model made him swear. "Those are flow maps," he said. "Airflow?" He looked at me. "Not only airflow, concentration gradients, I think. Mara, this wall is describing a plume." He said plume the way epigraphers say alphabet after 4 months of telling themselves it is certainly not an alphabet. At the far end of the chamber, behind the grove of antler forms, we found the first sealed cassettes. They were stacked in a honeycomb niche, thin as books, each one a porous slate enclosed in transparent mineral shells. We tagged them, scanned them, and took them to the temporary clean lab above, without opening any. My instinct was already screaming that the room itself was an instrument, and that random handling would be like banging on a Stradivarius with a shovel. We also found something else. Beyond a flexible membrane wall that yielded when touched, there was a second chamber lined with recesses. At first, in the crawler light, I thought they held bodies. There were 26 of them, each resting in a cradle of white lattice. Each was roughly man-sized, elongated and folded in on itself. No skeleton showed, no faces, no obvious limbs. The outer surfaces had the translucent, layered look of dried cuttlefish bone or the papery husk of a plant root. They were too regular for natural remains and too individualized for machine parts. Nor bent close to one cradle, light playing over her visor. "Not corpses," she said, "or not in any way I know." "What then?" She was silent for a moment. "Templates," she said at last. "Scaffolds, preserved developmental matrices maybe, waiting for conditions." I disliked that immediately. Waiting is an alarming word to apply to anything older than language. We sealed the second chamber and argued for 6 hours. By the second day, every theory that had seemed reasonable at breakfast had become embarrassing by lunch. The dating held. The chamber complex was ancient by any human standard and vastly older than any architecture in the Americas. Its materials were non-terrestrial in isotope ratio, but not supernatural. Several ceramics used silicon, aluminum, calcium, and carbon in arrangements that made our materials scientists purr and curse at once. The air composition inside the chamber was maintained by active processes, not decaying processes. Active. Most unsettling of all, the chemical pulses were changing in response to us. That conclusion arrived by way of failure. Human beings are sentimental enough to believe that mathematics is a universal greeting. On the second night, after the chamber had remained stubbornly uninterested in our presence beyond its atmospheric shifts, we tried the usual package of first contact cliches without saying out loud that that was what we were doing. Prime numbers played over a speaker, pulsed lights in simple ratios, shapes displayed on a portable panel, temperature modulations, radio bursts across a range of frequencies. The chamber responded to none of it in any way we could distinguish from its existing cycles. Then Tomas, who was nervous and who always broke rules in ways too small to feel like rebellion until later, cracked his suit seal to scratch his nose. Warren started yelling before the seal was fully reseated. Thomas flinched, breathed out hard, and in the same second, every column in the chamber gave a soft, synchronized tremor. The gas graphs on my wrist exploded. 100 compounds rose together in a burst shaped like nothing we had yet seen, fast onset, staggered peaks, controlled decay. The antler grove at the far wall shivered, and a cool draft moved from left to right across the room with enough force to tug at the fringes on our sleeves. Everyone went absolutely still. Do that again, Jin said. No, Warren snapped. Tomas, pale in the helmet light, whispered, I'm not doing anything. It answered your breath, Jin said. No, Noor said slowly. It answered him. Tomas stared at us. I'm not special. Jin was already pulling his portable sampler around. Exhaled CO2, water vapor, acetone, isoprene, trace aldehydes, stress markers. Human breath, I said. Human metabolic state, Jin corrected. He looked around the chamber with a kind of horrified wonder. We've been trying to talk to it with speakers. It's been talking to us through the ventilation. That was the moment the story changed shape in my head. Not because I understood it, I did not, but because environmental control ceased to be a serious explanation. Preservation matrix ceased. Decorative architecture ceased. The room had sensed a body by the atmosphere it generated and replied in equally structured chemistry. The columns were not air filters. They were mouths or hands or both. The next 48 hours would later be turned into documentaries, legal testimony, competing memoirs, 3 ugly streaming dramas, and a holiday special I have never forgiven. In memory, they are simpler. We learned that the chamber's background was not background at all, but low-level traffic. Recurring patterns passed among the columns and the wall ridges in compositions too structured for chemistry and too dynamic for static storage. When a person entered, the patterns changed according to that person's breath profile and more subtly to their sweat chemistry and stress physiology. Kellen and Noor produced different responses. Warren, who was almost supernaturally self-controlled, elicited calmer, lower-amplitude bursts than Tomas, who might as well have entered wrapped in panic. We learned that the surface above the buried complex was not featureless, as our first scans had suggested, but threaded with narrow vertical shafts and mineral chimneys filled with the same carbonaceous filaments as the chamber columns. They rose to the desert in a sparse pattern over nearly 4 kilometers, disguised by erosion and salt crust so effectively that no one had noticed them until we looked from below. At dusk, after a day of excavation-related temperature disturbance, the surface chimneys activated. The first drone footage came in just after sunset. In visible light, nothing. In thermal, faint plumes. In LIDAR, loaded with aerosol scatter enhancement, the desert lit up with braided verticals. Delicate rising threads from one chimney answered by another 1/2 kilometer away, then another farther off, until the whole basin was exchanging invisible streamers across the evening inversion layer, like a silent city signaling through incense. Jin watched the visualization and sat down on the lab floor without meaning to. Long distance, he said. Jesus. That word, from Jin, meant something between worship and defeat. The pattern was undeniable. The machines buried under the desert were communicating with machines on the surface by controlled release of volatile compounds into stratified air. Not random outgassing, not alarm behavior, not a leak. Packets, sequences, answers. They were using the atmosphere the way we use fiber optics. I had spent 20 years reading how humans extend thought into matter. Clay tablets, knotted cords, architecture, magnetic domains, optical lattices. It had not occurred to me that an intelligent species might choose the oldest medium of all, the one that is already half inside you when you are born. On the 3rd day, we opened the cassettes. I say opened. In practice, we spent 14 hours building a microclimate box, modeling airflow from the chamber, and humiliating 3 impatient administrators over video link until they backed off. Then we set one cassette inside the box, adjusted humidity upward by 2%, and warmed its surface by a carefully ridiculous amount. At first, nothing happened. Then the porous slate darkened in branching lines as adsorbed compounds desorbed from within its matrix, and the lab filled with a scent so overwhelming that even through my impairment I felt it as a pressure behind the eyes. Noor grabbed the table. Tomas made a low sound and sat down abruptly. Jin, who had refused the stronger filter hood because he wanted fidelity, laughed once and then put both hands over his face. The gas analyzer did not laugh. It recorded another staggering cloud of molecules, but unlike the chamber's traffic, this one unfolded over 11 minutes in segments. Ratios shifted with temperature. Certain compounds appeared only as oxidation products of earlier ones. Meaning, if it was meaning, was time-dependent. You had to live through the decay to receive the full thing. "A recording," I said. "More than a recording," Jin murmured from behind his hands. "A performance." We repeated the process with 5 more cassettes. Each produced a distinct emission structure. Each changed if humidity changed. Each changed again if the airflow geometry changed. We were not reading texts, we were instantiating them. Palimpsest, the site AI, spent the night correlating wall patterns, cassette output, chamber traffic, and our own biosignatures. By dawn, it had produced the first model good enough to embarrass us. The wall ridges were indeed plume maps, but not merely of concentration. They encoded flow direction, timing, and spatial layering. The column bursts were compositional chords, not single notes. The cassettes contained stabilized release programs in nanoporous ceramic matrices, comparable in principle to metal organic frameworks and zeolites, but far beyond anything I had seen. Storage media for sense written not as lists of molecules, but as physically constrained trajectories of molecules through time and air. Jin called it four-dimensional perfumery, and then apologized for trivializing what was clearly more like speech. Noor, who had by then dissected a shed filament from one column under a microscope, came in with the first real piece of biology. "They built their sensors like tissues," she said without preamble. "Not just inspired by tissues. The filaments are metabolically active at the surface. Catalytic proteins, receptor analogues, self-repair chemistry. Whoever made this didn't draw a clean line between machine and organism. That should have prepared me for the replication chamber. It did not. We entered it on day 6. The folded structures in the cradles were even less corpse-like up close. Each consisted of layered polymer sheets, mineralized proteins, and a fine vascular network of dried channels filled with crystalline residues. They were not dead bodies preserved against decay. They were more like dry seeds the size of people, or collapsed lungs waiting for breath. On the wall above them, almost hidden in the branching relief, Palimpsest identified a repeated structural motif linked across 3 cassettes and several chamber response patterns. It was the closest thing we had yet to a stable semantic cluster. The AI proposed translations including return, remake, stored person, and echoed self. Noor looked at the rows of folded forms and said very quietly, "Replications." The word stayed. That afternoon, Commander Warren received formal instructions from Santiago, Geneva, and 2 other cities not authorized to instruct her. The site was to remain sealed. No activation of additional systems, no exposure beyond strictly necessary study, no public disclosure of biological findings. The phrase novel xenobiological entity appeared 16 times. Warren obeyed the orders she could obey and ignored the ones she could not. The problem was humidity. The buried complex had survived 74 millennia because the Atacama is a miser. It gives up nothing willingly. But we had brought people, habitat modules, power systems, coolant, water recycling, soot condensation, and breath. Even with isolation curtains and desiccant trenches, the deeper chambers had begun to drift. Microscopic droplets formed where none had existed for ages. Adsorbed compounds released from surfaces. The replication chamber, which had clearly been designed to detect and use environmental changes, noticed. The first pod activated at 2:14 local time. No alarms went off because there were too many alarms already, and humans adapt to impossible numbers more quickly than they should. It was Noor who saw it on routine bioimaging, a slight temperature rise in cradle 12 and fluid movement in channels that had been dry since before agriculture. By the time we reached the chamber, the folded structure had expanded by perhaps 3 centimeters. Nothing in archaeology prepares you for watching an artifact wake up. It happened slowly enough to seem merciful and fast enough to make denial impossible. Over the next 18 hours, the dry lattice absorbed moisture from its sealed microenvironment, then synthesized its own. Crystalline reservoirs liquefied, protein films uncurled, tubular channels swelled and began pulsing with a clear, syrupy medium. Entire sheets that had appeared brittle lifted into supple membranes lined with dark, waving filaments. At no point did it resemble a human embryo or a mechanical assembly line. It resembled growth in the oldest sense, fronds opening, lungs inflating, coral taking shape, a flower choosing the geometry that will later be mistaken for purpose. By dawn on the second day, the replication stood upright in its cradle. It was taller than I expected, a little under 2 meters, but most of that height was a central column of pale, semi-translucent tissue reinforced by milky struts. Around the upper third unfurled 6 broad lamellar fans, each pleated into dozens of thin folds lined with receptor filaments that rippled at microscopic touch. Lower down, clusters of muscular vents opened and closed with measured delicacy. There were no eyes, no ears that we recognized, no mouth, unless the vents were mouths. The whole being, or machine, or both, had the composure of a white tree that had learned to breathe. It did not move when we spoke to it. It did not move when Warren flashed lights at it, or when Tomas held up mathematical patterns on a tablet, or when I, feeling stupid and dutiful at once, introduced myself in Spanish and then English. Then Jin, who had forgotten his fear in the face of his own fascination, stepped too close to the cradle and exhaled hard through his mask valve. The fans turned toward him instantly. Not by sight, by plume, every filament along the lamella lifted. Vents along its trunk opened in a sequence I already knew from the chamber data was structured. A new scent burst filled the room, dense enough that Kellen reeled backward and gripped the wall. "What did it do?" Warren snapped. Kellen looked sick. I don't know." He pulled off one glove with his teeth and wiped his eyes. For a second, I was in my father's garage. Nor turned from him to Jin. "What did you smell?" Jin did not answer. He was staring at the replication with tears standing in his eyes. Later, he told me it had smelled like first rain on Tokyo pavement, solder smoke, and the inside of his mother's handbag when he was 5. Tomas said it smelled like hot peaches in an exam room. Noor got ocean mud and cardamom and grief. I got almost nothing, only a cool sting and a sweetness so faint it might have been memory. Yet the biosensors on all of us registered a change. Heart rate variation smoothing in Noor, a stress spike in Kellen, lacrimation in Jin, skin conductance everywhere. The replication had not simply emitted molecules, it had, accidentally or otherwise, reached deep into the most private and poorly indexed museum humans carry. That was the first real crisis. Warren wanted the chamber flooded with inert gas and the active pod frozen. Kellen wanted it burned. Santiago wanted data, containment, and reassurance in an order impossible to satisfy. The media, having somehow learned that our anomalous structure had become responsive, began building 20 mutually exclusive narratives involving God, weaponized perfume, ancient civilizations, microbial hallucinations, and AI fraud. The only person in the complex who seemed pleased was Jin, which I considered irresponsible but understandable. Smell already ties into memory and emotion in humans more directly than vision or hearing, he said when Warren accused the replication of chemical manipulation. Our olfactory pathways hit limbic circuits with fewer relays. For them, whoever they were, that pathway is probably primary cognition. Of course, their language rides effect. Ours does too, just more dishonestly. "That thing made my security chief cry," Warren said. "By accident," Noor said, "or by politeness. It sensed distress and attempted regulation using the only medium it has." "You don't know that." No, Noor said. I know that we walked into a room full of alien noses and acted shocked when they smelled us. I said nothing for a long moment because I was thinking about archaeology again, about interpretation, about all the centuries humans had taken silent ruins and stuffed them with our own fears, desires, and gods. I did not want to become famous for repeating that mistake on an interstellar scale. The problem, I said finally, is translation. Warren gave me a bleak look. You have one? Not yet. In the camp's medbay I kept, for practical reasons and private bitterness, a synthetic olfaction bridge. It had been prescribed after Nevada, a cortical interface that took data from an electronic nose and stimulated my olfactory cortex with crude pattern sets. Mostly I used it for hazard work, gas leak, food spoilage, fire signatures. It was not smell, not truly, but a prosthetic approximation, like hearing music through a seismograph. Jin saw where my eyes had gone before I spoke. "Oh no," he said, already smiling with dread. "That's a terrible idea." "It's the best one we have." "No," he said. "It is merely the most interesting, terrible idea." By midnight, we had converted Lab 2 into an olfactory interface chamber. There are sentences I did not expect to type in my life. That is one of them. The build looked like an overfunded greenhouse crossed with an ICU bed. We installed a laminar flow canopy, a 3D grid of graphene-based receptor arrays functionalized with broad-spectrum binding peptides, an ion mobility spectrometer, and a bank of microfluidic emitters capable of synthesizing and releasing approximations of the alien volatile packets at safe concentrations. Palimpsest handled real-time pattern mapping. Med patched my cortical bridge into the synthesis loop. The plan was simple enough to sound sane until you said it aloud. Let the replication speak into the sensor lattice, reduce the chemical pattern into a high-dimensional signature, then stimulate my damaged olfactory cortex with an analog pattern I could consciously perceive. Warren called it reckless. Noor called it history. Jin called it barbaric but elegant. I called it Tuesday. I went in alone. The replication was waiting on the far side of the canopy, still rooted in its cradle platform, but now more mobile along its lower trunk, able to tilt and flex with unnerving grace. In the interface room, it had been provided with controlled humidity, airflow channels, and a neutral background atmosphere. The lamellae around its upper body opened as I entered, and for the first time I had the unmistakable sensation of being looked at by something that had no need of eyes. "Dr. Mara Vicuña," Palimpsest said in my ear, because the system insisted on formality at the threshold of the incomprehensible. "Bridge synchronized. Initial stimulation intensity low. Report distress immediately." "Noted." I sat in the chair, temple leads cool against my skin, and watched the replication taste my breath through 3 layers of filters and hardware. It emitted. The world changed. People ask me what the first translated alien sentence smelled like, and the true answer is that smell is too small a word. At low intensity, the bridge had always given me abstractions: sharpness, sweetness, rot, smoke. This was nothing like that. This was geometry entering through a forgotten door in my brain. A volume unfolded behind my eyes. Wet stone, yes, but not wet stone as a thing in the world. Wet stone as opening after long closure. Green bitterness, but braided with caution. An edge of metallic brightness that carried attention. Then, trailing the first wave, a soft decay note whose only human analog I can offer is the feeling of someone pausing at a threshold to make certain you are willing. Information and stance, data and etiquette inseparable. I gasped. Tears sprang into my eyes before I knew why. "Mara?" Noor said in my ear. "I'm here," I whispered. The replication's fans lifted, settled, and emitted again. The second packet was easier, not because it was simpler, but because my brain had been given a coordinate system. I felt the pattern brush against the first like braided streamers in wind. Identity. Not a name as humans use names, not a label detachable from the thing itself, but a self-introduction containing origin, continuity, and relation. Palimpsest tried 3 text glosses before settling on a disgracefully poetic cluster. After rain on basalt / memory of heat / third returning. Jin swore softly over the channel. I think, I said, voice shaking. I think it's telling me what it is. I do not remember the next hour in linear sequence. Human memory is bad enough in ordinary conversation. In that chamber, it became ridiculous. The bridge translated only a fraction. Palimpsest lagged behind the replication constantly. Several times, the machine in front of me emitted patterns that my brain accepted whole, and my language centers could not unpack until minutes later. I began taking notes with my hands because my mouth had ceased to be reliable. Here is what we learned. The species had no clean distinction between speech, record, and presence. To them, a statement was a controlled atmospheric event whose shape through time and space constituted meaning. Molecules were not their alphabet any more than pixels are ours. They were the embodied substrate of a larger form involving ratios, timing, chirality, humidity, carrier particles, and flow topology. One message could not be separated from the conditions under which it was released and perceived. Context was grammar. Their bodies had evolved under a dense, stratified atmosphere on a world of long canyons and thermal inversions. Across much of that world, dawn and dusk created stable layers in which plumes could travel for kilometers with remarkably low turbulence. Their ancestors had exploited those layers first for mating and territorial marking, then for coalition behavior, and eventually for abstract thought. Where our species exteriorized cognition through tools that detached symbol from body, marks, sounds, signals, they had exteriorized it through chemical weather. They built towers the way we built bells. They organized cities around airflow. Their neural tissue devoted immense real estate to olfaction, receptor families in the tens of thousands, constant adult neurogenesis, distributed processing lobes along body structures that were not quite noses and not quite lungs, but functioned as both input and expression. Memory and emotion, therefore, were not inconvenient companions to reason. They were reason's atmosphere. Their machines copied this seamlessly. Sensors were living filters. Archives were porous ceramics programmed to release thoughts when properly breathed. Replications were not clones in our cinematic sense, but re-instantiable persons, stored relation patterns, body plans, and memory structures capable of growing a local interface body suited to the available environment. And they had come to Earth as archaeologists. That last fact took longest to believe, perhaps because it insulted my profession by making it look small. Not conquerors, not refugees, not tourists, atmospheric historians. They had found Earth when our species was young and our civilization non-existent. The replication gave a date, then another packet that took palimpsest 6 minutes to reduce to a phrase I could understand. Before your metal / after your great cold ash. Much later, we correlated it roughly with the late Pleistocene, not long after a volcanic winter had scarred climate records and long before cities. Why Earth, then? Because the replication conveyed, planets speak long before they know they are speaking. Its makers had studied inhabited worlds by their atmospheres. Industrial chemistry is obvious, of course, but even pre-technological biospheres have signatures. Oxygen disequilibria, sulfur cycles, methane pulses, wildfire regimes, resin clouds, blood, rot, migration, agriculture. They had learned to distinguish worlds hosting intelligence from worlds merely full of life, not by radio leakage but by layered instability in the chemical envelope, a kind of metabolic rhetoric. Earth, when they found us, was not yet technological, but it was promising. Its air carried what the translation glossed with maddening imprecision as buried speech, potential. a planet not yet talking but changing its breath in ways that suggested it would. So they came. They chose the Atacama because its dryness preserved their archives, its basin geometry supported controlled plume transmission, and its evening inversions resembled conditions on parts of their homeworld. They buried an archive and a set of chimneys. They sampled Earth's atmosphere, hydrology, soils, pollens, smoke, and later, through means I still do not fully understand, its changing chemical civilization. They left replications because the whole point of archaeology to them was not collection. It was eventual reciprocity. A dead world could be studied. A living world should, given enough time, answer back. At some point during this explanation, I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the scale of it tore something open in me. "We thought," I said to the pale thing swaying in front of me, "that we had discovered you." A new packet came, softer, warmer. The bridge rendered it with a sweetness and mineral depth that made my chest hurt. Palimpsest's gloss appeared on the side of my vision, and for once it got close enough to poetry that I forgive it. "You have opened the house in which we kept your weather." I do not know how long I sat there after that. The replication, third returning, or rain on basalt, or whatever mutilated human approximation you prefer, continued to speak, and the team outside the chamber continued to translate, debate, and occasionally fall silent for entire minutes. We learned that the original expedition had not remained on Earth indefinitely. The archive had been designed to persist autonomously, waking replications only when local conditions indicated an interlocutor capable of excavation and instrument-level atmospheric discrimination. We learned that the species' long-range interstellar communication used other media for physics, as ours must, but that no true diplomatic contact was considered complete without shared chemistry. Sound, in their view, was useful for distance in emergencies and for certain kinds of mechanical coordination. Smell was for mind. We learned that one of the reasons human reactions had varied so violently was that their communicative packets interacted with associative memory architecture in a way our species was evolutionarily unprepared to pass. They had not intended to manipulate us. They had intended to be legible. The result, filtered through our impoverished receptor repertoire and our private emotional archives, was often overwhelming. And near the end, when my brain was exhausted and the bridge had burned a tender ache behind my eyes, the replication asked for something. It wanted the last chamber opened. There had been hints of it in the scans, a deeper cavity under the archive core, inaccessible from the rooms we had entered, shielded by a material denser than the surrounding ceramic. We had assumed power systems, or structural anchoring, or the alien equivalent of a vault. Santiago had already sent 3 messages explicitly forbidding unauthorized breach. I exited the interface chamber to a wall of faces, Noor bright and frightened, Jin feverish with thought, Warren holding herself in command by a margin measurable in molecules. "It asked," I said, "for us to open the final chamber." "That's convenient," Warren said. "It said the archive is incomplete without witness." "That is not an authorization." "No," I said. "It's a request." Warren looked at me for a long time. Perhaps she saw what the bridge had done. Perhaps she recognized the particular unsteadiness of a person who has just spent an hour discovering that the universe is both stranger and more courteous than she had budgeted for. Perhaps she simply trusted that if I was willing to put my professional life through a shredder in front of 4 governments, I had a reason. "Record everything," she said. We opened it at dusk. The lower chamber did not contain weapons, reactors, or kings. It contained Earth. Not literally, of course, but more intimately than any museum I have ever entered. The room was circular, wider than the others, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with shelves of sealed vessels and porous tablets, each nested in a branching support. The central floor held a basin crossed by fine channels. Above, the ceiling opened into a slow-turning lattice of membranes that adjusted airflow so delicately that even I could feel the room arranging itself around our presence. Every vessel in the chamber was tagged with the same structural motif we had seen nowhere else in such density. A repeating branch, a looping return, a cluster, then divergence. Palimpsest translated it after a long pause as something like stratum or era layer. Nor lifted one vessel into the microclimate reader. The first sample, when released, produced a scent structure so animal and green that even my damaged nose caught its body. Damp fur, cold water, crushed sedge, a sudden iron edge. Jin inhaled once and whispered, Pleistocene. The second was ash, dry grass, resin, and a sulfur bite that made Thomas cough. Wildfire, volcanic influence. Another held salt, rotting kelp, gull guano, iodine, storm. Another, much later in the stratigraphy, carried smoke from controlled burns, cereal husk dust, domestic dung, fermented starch, cut earth. Agriculture. The room was an atmospheric chronology. Layer by layer, sample by sample, the archive had kept Earth's breath. Not just broad environmental history, finer than that. Trade smoke, metalworking, the sharp, sweet poison of leaded fuel, the chlorinated cleanliness of 20th century solvents, refrigerants, explosives, industrial nitriles, petrochemical plastics, ozone recovery, battery electrolytes, melting permafrost methane pulses, fusion pilot plant tritium traces, orbital propellant leaks, server farm coolant signatures, human civilization reduced not to monuments but to what it taught the sky to remember. No historian had ever owned anything like it. No historian should. I stood in that chamber while Earth's ages passed through filters and pores into the human present, and for the first time in my life I felt embarrassed by our species' faith in stone. We had carved our names into mountains and assumed permanence. These beings had collected the changing composition of a planet's boundary layer and preserved not our vanity, but our metabolism. Jin was openly crying now. Noor had gone very quiet. Even Warren, whose job required resistance to awe, removed one glove and pressed bare fingers against the support rail as if grounding herself. At the far side of the chamber, behind the last shelves of Earth samples, stood another row of cradles. Most were empty. Not empty in the sense of unused. Empty in the sense of reserved. The replication had followed us partway down, moving with patient, rootless grace, its lower trunk supported by a temporary mobility frame Thomas had designed from a sample cart and too little sleep. It stopped beside the empty cradles and emitted a sequence so gentle I almost missed it. The bridge was still active at low level. The meaning entered me slowly. Archive requires mutual memory. Noor looked at me. What does that mean? I swallowed. It means, I said, that they didn't come here just to record us. They expected, if we were ever worth meeting, that we would become part of the archive too. Thomas laughed the laugh of a man who badly needed any other career. You're saying it wants to preserve people? Replicate, Noor said. Not biologically. Not as copies to release. As stored persons in their medium. Kellen, who had recovered enough skepticism to be useful again, said, Absolutely not. Warren said nothing. A cool thread of air passed over us from the ceiling lattice. Somewhere above ground, the surface chimneys had begun their dusk traffic again. Through the shaft feeds, we could see the desert visualization. One plume rising, then another, the basin filling with unseen syntax. The replication emitted once more. This time the bridge gave me not only meaning, but attitude, patience, invitation, a kind of formality that felt almost ceremonial. First contact is when each can remember the other from within. I have repeated that sentence in hearings, classrooms, documentaries, and one dreadful magazine profile in which the writer insisted on calling me the woman who smelled eternity. It has never improved in repetition. What happens, Warren asked quietly, if we refuse? The replication's lamellae folded slightly inward, then opened. A gesture, a clause marker, grief? I do not know. Then came the answer, you remain known only as weather. That silenced us, because it was not a threat. It was worse and better than that. It was classification. It was the difference between a world that has spoken and one that has merely leaked. I ought to tell you that we debated for hours, that ethics boards were convened, that consent frameworks were drafted, that humanity rose magnificently to the occasion of being asked whether it wished to be archived by a civilization older than its myths. Some of that happened later. What happened then was simpler. One of the empty cradles warmed. No visible mechanism triggered it, no person touched it. Yet as the replication continued its exchange with the surface network and my own breath fogged faintly inside my mask, channels within the nearest empty lattice darkened and began to fill with clear fluid. Tomas took one look at the biosignature match on his tablet and made a strangled sound. "Mara," he said. I stepped closer. The cradle's intake filaments had oriented toward me. Palimpsest, whose idea of tact had always been largely aspirational, projected the analysis into my visual field in crisp text. Exhaled volatile correlation, 0.83 and rising. Noor read it over my shoulder. It's indexing you. Not building a clone, not downloading my mind, nothing so crude. The active cradle had been sampling the chemical envelope around me for days. Breath, skin aldehydes, trace ketones, stress hormones, microbial volatiles, the whole ridiculous intimate atmospheric halo a human body sheds without permission. Now, in the presence of explicit reciprocity, it had begun using that information to instantiate the first layer of a human archive pattern, a replication of me but not me. A scent-structured remembrance in their form of keeping. I should tell you I recoiled. Instead, I laughed again once, helplessly. Of course, it had chosen the archaeologist. Or perhaps not chosen. Perhaps I had done what archaeologists always do, entered the record so deeply that it started recording back. Warren stepped beside me. "Your call," she said. I will always love her for that, not because command became democratic. It did not. But because in that moment she recognized the difference between danger and relation. I looked at the pale replication, at the empty cradles beginning to breathe the future, at the shelves of Earth's ancient atmosphere arranged with more care than most nations give their dead. Then I did the only honest thing I could think of. I removed my outer glove, broke protocol so completely that 6 careers died in sympathy, and laid my bare hand against the warm lattice of the waking cradle. The material under my palm shivered, then settled. The replication emitted a burst so soft that only the bridge caught its full contour. Welcome/witness/returning. Above us, through 80 meters of stone and salt, the desert towers answered one another across the cooling air. That night I went outside alone. The Atacama after sunset is not empty. It is simply vast enough that sound gives up first. Our camp generators hummed at the edge of hearing. Beyond the perimeter lights, the basin opened under a sky so full of stars it looked theoretical. The chimneys were invisible in ordinary light. Through the modified visor Jin had given me, their plumes appeared as faint silver braids climbing into the inversion layer, flattening, drifting, intersecting. Machine spoke to machine through the desert's patient evening weather. The buried archive talked to its outlying mouths. The active replication below talked to the archive. My own body, ridiculous mammalian furnace that it was, contributed a tiny, ongoing paragraph to the nearest intake. I turned the bridge intensity up just a little and the night changed. Suddenly, the basin was not empty at all. It was crowded with exchange. I could not pass most of it. No human could, not yet. But one rising sequence from the central chimney came through with enough clarity to make me stop walking. It carried formal announcement. release from waiting, the satisfaction of a pattern completed after intolerable duration. It carried, too, the note I had learned meant witness. Palimpsest would later render it as exhibit awakened, interlocutor present, reciprocity begins. That was accurate in the way maps are accurate. What I experienced was closer to this. At last, the buried world has inhaled knowingly. I stood there for a long time, tears cooling in the desert air, smelling more than I had smelled in years, and less than the beings below had meant by speaking. Behind me, in a chamber older than our cities, a white lattice was learning the chemistry of my living body. Under the shelves of Earth's remembered atmosphere, a place had been made for the first human who had answered. We had gone into the desert expecting a ruin. We found an archive, an embassy, a museum, a machine ecology, a deferred greeting, and the humiliating fact that for 74,000 years someone else had been doing archaeology on us. By dawn, the world knew enough to become loud about it. By the end of the week, there were treaties in draft, markets in spasm, theologians performing acrobatics on every channel, and schoolchildren learning the phrase chemical language badly and with enthusiasm. Within a month, labs on 4 continents were building lawful, safer olfactory interfaces. Within a year, no serious theory of intelligence could afford to be only visual and acoustic again. But those things belong to history. What belongs to me is the last image from that first night, returning below ground, passing through the cool chambers into the final room, and seeing that the cradle linked to my breath had thickened its first translucent folds. Not a body, not yet. A structure of memory beginning. The archive had started to remember me in air. And I, who had spent my life brushing dust from the dead to make them speak, finally understood the simplest and strangest truth of all. We had not merely dug up the aliens. They had been excavating us.